The chandeliers glittered like they were in on the secret. 3 generations of the CO family stood frozen in place, dressed in silk and pride, waiting for one perfect photograph. And then everything shattered. "You're ruining the family photo." Lady Han's voice cut through the room like a blade wrapped in silk. "Step out. You don't belong in this family." Every conversation in that ballroom died at once. Hundreds of eyes turned toward one woman. "Oh, Dallas!" She felt her hand instinctively loosen from Juan Rial's grip. Years of practice told her exactly what to do next. Smile, retreat, disappear quietly the way she always had. But this time, something was different. Juan Rial didn't move, not because he agreed, because 37 years of obedience were fighting a war against the man he was finally becoming. Lady Han raised her chin, victorious already. "Photographer," she said coldly. "Continue." And that's when it happened. Juan Rial took one step, then another. "Stay with me," because the moment his face froze in that camera flash, it wasn't defeat. It was the beginning of everything changing. But to understand how we got here, to this exact frozen second, we have to go back 3 months earlier. Rain doesn't usually feel like a warning, but that morning, it did. Odalis Whitmore sat outside a crumbling building in Los Angeles, staring at peeling paint and boarded windows like most people would stare at ruins. She didn't see ruins. She saw a home worth preserving. This was the historic Korean American Cultural Center, built decades ago by people who had nothing but hope, sweat, and each other. Now it was falling apart, forgotten by almost everyone. Almost. She stepped inside, dust swirling in the light behind her, when she heard footsteps. Careful, measured, like someone who'd learned long ago that quiet was safer than loud. "You must be the preservation consultant," a man's voice said. "I was told you'd be thorough." "And you must be funding this rescue mission," Odalis answered. "I was told you'd be late." He turned around, and for 1 second, neither of them said a word. Seo Juan Rial, 37, heir to one of Korea's largest hospitality empires. But standing there in dust and shadows, he didn't look like a man who owned half a continent. He looked like someone quietly searching for somewhere to belong. "I run the nonprofit division," he said. "This building matters to my family legacy more than people know." "It matters to mine, too," Odalis said softly. "Just a different kind of family." Neither of them knew it yet, but that sentence would define everything that came after. They moved deeper into the building, flashlights slicing through dust, until Odalis stopped in front of an old photograph wall. "Wait," she whispered. "Look at this." Faded black and white images, Korean immigrants and African American church members standing shoulder to shoulder, hammers in hand, building this very center together, decades ago. "This wasn't just a Korean project," she said, voice breaking slightly. "This was ours, both of ours." Juan Rial stared at the photo for a long moment. Something in his face softened. The careful, guarded look he'd worn since she met him, quietly falling away. "I've walked past this building my entire life," he said quietly, "and I never knew our families built it side by side." He reached out and touched the edge of the frame, like he was afraid it might disappear if he wasn't gentle enough. "Some things," Odalis said, "only reveal themselves to people who are actually looking." He glanced at her then, really looked at her. And for a moment, neither of them was talking about the photograph anymore. Something shifted between them right there. Recognition. Like 2 people who'd spent their whole lives protecting things nobody else valued, finally standing in the same room. But this was only the beginning, because over the following weeks, They weren't just restoring a building, they were rebuilding something in each other. Long nights cataloging old artifacts turned into long conversations about childhood, gospel choirs that shook church walls, Chuseok mornings spent bowing to ancestors, grandmothers who taught them the same lesson in 2 different languages. One night, working late, Odalis found herself struggling to lift a warped display case on her own. Before she could ask, Juan Rial was already there, steadying the other end without a word, without making it a moment, without letting her feel like she needed rescuing. That was the thing about him she was starting to notice. He never made his help feel like charity. He just showed up quietly, exactly when it mattered. "Preserving memories," Odalis said one evening, wiping dust from an old hymn book, "means preserving people." Juan Rial looked at her like she'd read his mind. "Mine used to say the exact same thing," he said. "Just in Korean." They laughed, and for the first time in a long while, laughter didn't feel like something either of them had to perform. She noticed something else that night, too. The way he listened, not waiting for his turn to speak, the way most people did. Actually listening, like her stories mattered enough to keep. Nobody outside her own family had ever listened to her quite like that. But you're not ready for what I'm about to tell you. Because every few hours, his phone would buzz, and every single time, something in his face would shift. Odalis noticed it before she ever said anything. A message would arrive. His shoulders would stiffen. His smile would dim, like a light flickering in a room no one else could see. "You okay?" she asked one evening. "Fine," he said too quickly. "Family things." She didn't push. Not yet, but she felt it. An invisible weight resting on him, something he wasn't ready to name, and she found herself wondering, quietly, privately, what kind of family could put that look on a grown man's face with nothing but a text message. By the final week, everything between them had changed completely. "I want to expand this," Juan Rial told her, the newly restored ceiling glowing above them. "Not just this building. Preservation projects across countries. Korean heritage. African American heritage. Communities the world forgets." Odalis felt her heart stop for a second. That was her exact dream. Word for word. "I'm in," she said, before she could even think twice. In that moment, she believed she'd found more than a partner in preservation. She believed she'd found a partner for life. She had no idea how wrong that feeling was about to become, because 3,000 miles away, in an office made of cold marble and colder ambition, a woman looked at a photograph of her son standing close to a woman she never approved of. Lady Han Soo-yeon didn't raise her voice. She never needed to. She simply set the phone down and said 5 words. "Find out everything about her." 2 months passed, and Juan Rial wanted Odalis to see where he truly came from. Not the empire, not the boardrooms, his heart. So he took her to Charleston first to meet her family. The moment he stepped into Lorraine Whitmore's home, laughter exploded through the air before he'd even reached the door. Music drifted from the kitchen. The smell of cornbread and greens filled every corner. Lorraine pulled him into a hug like she'd known him for years. "Come in, baby. Sit down. You hungry? Course you're hungry." Dinner wasn't quiet. It was loud, warm, full of stories and old gospel hymns breaking out mid-conversation. Someone's cousin got teased for falling asleep in church. Someone's uncle told the same fishing story he told every year, and everyone let him because some stories are less about the fish and more about the telling. Juan Rial sat in the middle of it all, plate refilled twice without asking, and for once in his life, he didn't feel like he had to earn his place at the table. He simply had one. He watched Odalis across the room, laughing so freely, so completely herself, and understood, maybe for the first time, what he'd been missing his entire life without knowing its name. Later, sitting on the porch as the night cooled around them, he was quiet for a long moment. "I don't want to leave," he admitted. "I don't remember the last time a room felt like this." Odalis leaned her shoulder against his. "This is just Tuesday for us." "Then I envy your Tuesdays," he said, and meant it. Driving home that night, emotion thick in his voice, he said, "I want my mother to feel that. I want her to know you the way I know you." Odalis smiled, hope blooming in her chest. She let herself sit inside that hope a little longer than usual, turning it over like something precious. Maybe, she thought, this could actually work. Maybe love really was enough. She had no idea that hope was about to be tested, because days later she met Lady Han for the first time during an elegant tea ceremony wrapped in silk, tradition, and quiet judgment disguised as grace. Lady Han's smile was flawless. Her words were weapons wrapped in velvet. "Whitmore," she said, tasting the name like it was unfamiliar. "And your family? Charleston?" "Yes," Odalis said politely. "Generations." "How quaint," Lady Han said, sipping her tea. "And your education?" "Architectural preservation, master's degree from—" "How resourceful," Lady Han interrupted. "Some people succeed, despite limited beginnings." The insult landed soft and precise. Odalis felt it, but her smile didn't break. She'd survived rooms like this her whole life. Grace, patience, endurance. "I do hope," Lady Han continued, eyes narrowing slightly, "that you can adapt to our way of doing things. Some backgrounds require more adjustment than others. Family, you understand, is not something one simply joins. It's something one is suited for." There it was, small, almost polite, but unmistakable. Suited for. As if belonging were a garment Odalis hadn't been measured for. Odalis's smile held steady, but something inside her cracked, just a little. Under the table, she felt Juan Riol's hand find hers, brief, firm, unnoticed by anyone else in the room. He didn't say anything. He couldn't, not yet, but the gesture said what he wasn't ready to say out loud. "I see it. I see what she's doing." It wasn't enough. Not really. But it was something. She told herself it was fine. She told herself patience would earn acceptance eventually. She had no idea Lady Han wasn't looking for adjustment. She was looking for surrender. Driving home, Juan Riol reached for her hand again, this time in the open. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "She just needs time. She'll come around." Odalis squeezed his hand back, choosing, for now, to believe him. She wanted to believe him. It was easier than the alternative. But what neither of them knew was that Lady Han had already made her decision, and it had nothing to do with time. That same night, she summoned Yun Harin, the family's longtime event coordinator, a woman who understood exactly what silence could cost. "Begin adjusting the guest lists," Lady Han said calmly. "Family functions only. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious." "You want her excluded," Harin said quietly. "I want her to exclude herself," Lady Han corrected. "Eventually." And just like that, the trap was set. Because days later, an invitation arrived at the SEO estate. Everyone was invited to the annual ancestral memorial. Everyone. Except Odalis. But what happened next, nobody saw coming. The day of the memorial, Odalis sat alone in her hotel room, staring at an invitation that never came. She let herself feel it, just for a minute. The sting of being the only name missing from a list. The particular loneliness of being unwanted somewhere she'd already opened her heart to. She could have been angry. She could have demanded answers. Instead, she closed her eyes, breathed once, and opened her laptop. If they won't make room for me, she thought, I'll make room for myself. She poured herself into grant research for the Preservation Initiative, work so sharp, so precise, that 2 international donors reached out that same afternoon, eager to fund the project's global expansion. She was building a legacy, even while being quietly erased from a family that refused to see her worth. But halfway through the afternoon, her phone rang. Rin panicked. I need your help, she whispered. The memorial venue, there's a structural issue near the ancestral altar. If it fails during the ceremony, send me the blueprints, Odalis said instantly. No hesitation. Within minutes, she found the exact failure point, a support beam replaced decades earlier with mismatched materials, invisible to anyone without her exact expertise. Disaster, quietly prevented. Harin's voice cracked with relief through the phone. I don't know how to thank you. You don't have to, Odalis said. Just make sure it holds. But once the fix was in motion, Odalis did something no one expected. She changed out of the dress she'd almost worn, just in case. She looked at herself in the mirror for a long moment. A woman who had just saved an entire ceremony for a family that hadn't wanted her there in the first place. And she left. Before the ceremony even began. Because this wasn't her place. Not yet. Not by invitation. And she refused to intrude where she hadn't been welcomed. There was a strange dignity in that walk to her car. No applause waiting for her, no one to see what she'd done. Just the quiet, private knowledge that she had done the right thing anyway, not for recognition, but because it was who she was. Sometimes the loneliest moments are the ones that reveal exactly what a person is made of. The memorial went on flawlessly. Guests praised Lady Han for hosting once again, a perfect and prestigious event. No one mentioned the crisis that almost happened. No one knew who saved it. Until Juan Rial found out. Later that night, Harin quietly told him everything. How Odalis solved the problem, expected nothing, and disappeared before anyone could thank her. Something cracked inside him. He sat with that knowledge alone for a long time afterward, replaying it. The woman his mother had called unsuitable had just saved his family's most sacred tradition and asked for nothing in return. Not gratitude, not credit, not even a seat at the table. For the first time, he wondered if his silence, the same silence that had kept peace in his family his whole life, wasn't protecting anyone at all. Maybe it was protecting something else entirely. Injustice. He confronted his mother carefully, choosing his words like a man walking on glass. She saved the entire memorial, he said, and she wasn't even invited. Lady Han didn't flinch. Gratitude, she said simply, is not the same as acceptance. One sentence. And her position was painfully clear, but Juan Rial didn't argue. Not yet, because somewhere deep down he still believed, foolishly, that patience could soften cruelty. He had no idea how wrong he was about to be proven. Here's something worth sitting with for a second. Notice how long Odalis stayed graceful in rooms that gave her nothing back. That's not weakness. That's a woman who's been taught her whole life that dignity is armor, and armor only cracks when the right person finally sees what it's costing her. Weeks later, a restoration trip took them both to a small village in Korea, one of the final preservation sites before their initiative launched internationally. And it was here that Odalis found something she didn't expect: belonging. She sat with elderly villagers for hours, listening to stories passed down through generations, survival, resilience, sacrifices nobody wrote down. And she realized something beautiful. Their oral traditions weren't so different from her own. Grandparents passing down memory like sacred inheritance. voices refusing to let history disappear. The elders adored her, not despite her difference, but because of the respect she brought to their stories. One woman took Odalis's hand and pressed it between both of hers, no translation needed for what that meant. Juan Rial watched from a distance, something unfamiliar rising in his chest. Pride, maybe, or grief for all the years he'd spent believing that this, ease, warmth, belonging without conditions, wasn't something his family was capable of giving anyone. One evening, an elderly grandmother pulled him aside, her voice soft but firm. "A man who cannot protect kindness," she said, "eventually loses it." Juan Rial said nothing, but her words settled somewhere deep inside him, somewhere he wouldn't be able to ignore much longer. Odalis, unaware of the conversation, felt something different entirely. Hope. She believed this trip had softened things, that maybe, just maybe, Lady Han's heart was finally opening. She had never been more wrong, because while Odalis built genuine connection in that village, Lady Han was working just as hard 3,000 miles away, in the opposite direction. Quiet phone calls, careful conversations with board members. "She's talented," Lady Han would say, voice smooth as silk. "But is she truly representative of the SEO legacy internationally? Perhaps her image requires reconsideration." Poison, disguised as concern. And it was working. Meanwhile, back in Korea, Min Seok, Juan Rial's cousin, a documentary filmmaker who'd spent years quietly capturing the truth behind his family's polished image, stumbled onto something devastating. Emails, call logs, records. Proof that this wasn't misunderstanding. This was sabotage, deliberate, calculated. Weeks in the making. Min Seok stared at it for a long time, hands trembling slightly. Exposing it could fracture the family beyond repair. But staying silent meant letting cruelty win. He made his decision. But what happened when he showed Juan Rial the truth would change everything. Min Seok didn't waste time with soft introductions. He slid his laptop across the table and said simply, "You need to see this." Message after message, call after call. Undeniable proof that his mother hadn't just disapproved of Odalis. She had been quietly destroying her for weeks. Juan Rial felt his chest cave in. "This isn't misunderstanding," he whispered. "This is deliberate." "She's trying to convince the board Odalis isn't fit to represent the family internationally," Min Seok said. "She's been doing it for weeks." Juan Rial confronted his mother that same night. Lady Han didn't deny a single word. She simply folded her hands, composed as ever, and said, "I am protecting generations of family honor by destroying an innocent woman?" Juan Rial asked, voice shaking with something he rarely let himself feel. "Anger. By preserving what matters," she said coldly. "You'll understand one day." He wanted to argue. He wanted to demand she stop. He wanted finally to stand up to the woman who had controlled every part of his life. But years of conditioning ran deep. He left the conversation without truly challenging her at all, ashamed of his own hesitation, furious at his own silence. But the real damage was still coming, because when Odalis learned the truth, that Juan Rial had known about the sabotage far longer than he admitted, something in her broke in a way Lady Han's insults never managed to. "You knew," she said quietly, staring at him like she was seeing him for the first time. "You knew, and you said nothing." "I didn't know how to tell you," he said. "I didn't want to hurt you." "You didn't protect me from being hurt," she said, voice trembling. "You protected yourself from having to choose." "If you've ever loved someone who kept the truth from you to keep the peace," You already know. This isn't about the lie. It's about what the silence was really protecting. I need you to figure out who you want to be, she said softly, because I can't keep loving someone who disappears every time it matters most. She stepped back. Wedding plans, postponed indefinitely. Juan Rial reached for her, panic rising in his chest, but before he could say another word, Odalis turned. And for the first time since they'd met, she walked away before he could stop her. He stood there long after her car pulled away, the quiet of the room pressing in on him like something physical. He didn't cry, not at first. He just sat down on the edge of the bed they'd shared plans in, staring at nothing. For 37 years, silence had been his survival. It had kept him fed, kept him safe, kept the family intact. Tonight, for the first time, it had cost him the one person who'd ever made him feel like he didn't need to survive anything at all. He put his head in his hands and let himself feel exactly how much he'd lost. He didn't move for a long time. The room stayed exactly as it was, her side of the bed still slightly dented from where she'd sat an hour ago, her perfume still hanging faint in the air, like she hadn't really left yet. But she had. Juan Rial sat there until the light outside changed from evening to something darker, and somewhere in that darkness, one thought kept circling back to him, sharper each time. She didn't leave because she stopped loving me. She left because I never gave her a reason to stay. 3,000 miles away, Odalis sat across from her mother's kitchen table, a cup of tea going cold in her hands. Lorraine watched her daughter for a long moment before she spoke. "You're not falling apart," she said gently. "You're just finally telling the truth to yourself." "I don't know how to do this without him," Odalis admitted, voice small in a way it rarely was. "Baby," Lorraine said, reaching across the table to take her hand. "You built your whole life before that man walked into it. You'll build the next part, too." Odalis let those words settle, and somewhere underneath the ache, something steadier began to take root. "You spend your whole career," Lorraine continued, "making sure forgotten places don't disappear. Don't you dare let yourself become one of them." That night, Odalis didn't sleep much, but she did open her laptop, and she started building. Not waiting, not hoping, not pausing her life for a phone call that might never come. She reached out to the international donors herself. She drafted the foundation's charter alone, line by line, pouring every ounce of grief into something that would outlast it. Within 2 weeks, she'd secured provisional funding for what she now called the Afro-Korean Cultural Preservation Initiative. Her dream, standing entirely on her own 2 feet. And when invitations arrived for smaller CO family gatherings, casual dinners, minor events, she declined every single one. Politely, firmly, not out of bitterness, out of self-respect. "Until there's mutual respect," she wrote back to Ha-Rin one evening, "there's no reason for me to be there." Ha-Rin stared at that message for a long time before replying. In all her years working for the SEO family, she'd never seen anyone draw a boundary with that much grace. And here's the thing nobody expected. Odalis's absence didn't go unnoticed, because without her steady presence, the family gatherings felt hollow, colder. Juan Rial sat through dinners that used to feel unbearable and realized, painfully, just how much lighter they'd become when she was beside him. She hadn't just been someone he loved. She'd been the reason the room felt survivable at all. That realization hit him harder than any of his mother's cruelty ever had. So he did something he'd never done in his entire life. He asked for help, not from his mother, not from the board, from a quiet therapist's office in Seoul, where he sat across from a stranger and said, For the first time out loud, "I think I was taught that silence was love." Session by session, he peeled back years of conditioning. The way every mistake as a child had been punished, the way opinions had been dangerous, the way obedience had kept him safe, but had also kept him small. "You survived by disappearing," his therapist told him one afternoon. "But love requires you to show up, fully, even when it's frightening." Juan Rial sat with that for a long time. He thought about Odalis walking away. He thought about every moment he could have stood between her and his mother. And didn't. And slowly, painfully, he began to understand exactly what he needed to become. But before he could prove any of it to her, his mother made a move neither of them saw coming, without asking Juan Rial, without asking Odalis. Lady Han announced the engagement celebration herself. The invitation arrived at Odalis's door like a challenge disguised as an olive branch. Elegant calligraphy, gold trim. Lady Han's name printed boldly at the top, not Juan Rial's. Odalis stared at it for a long time before calling him. "She didn't ask either of us," she said quietly. "I know," Juan Rial said. "I found out the same way you did." There was a pause, heavier than either of them wanted to admit. "I need you to understand something," he said, voice steady in a way it hadn't been in weeks. "I'm not the same man who let you walk out that door. I've been doing the work. I'm still doing it. And whatever she's planning, I won't let you stand in it alone." Odalis closed her eyes. She wanted to believe him. For once. She let herself. The night of the celebration, two entirely different worlds collided under one roof. The Whitmores arrived with warmth radiating ahead of them. Lorraine embracing every stranger like family, cousins laughing too loud for the room's hushed elegance. Heartfelt toasts that made half the SEO relatives visibly uncomfortable and the other half quietly moved. The SEO family, by contrast, moved like a perfectly choreographed performance. Flawless posture, measured smiles, prestige radiating from every crystal glass and tailored silk gown. Two definitions of family, standing in the same ballroom, neither quite sure what to make of the other. Harin found Odalis near the edge of the room, voice low and urgent. "She's too calm tonight," Harin whispered. "I've worked for that woman for over a decade. When she's loud, she's careless. When she's quiet like this..." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Across the room, Juan Rial watched his mother personally direct the photographer, adjusting the seating chart herself, repositioning name cards with the precision of someone building towards something. Something about it made his stomach tighten. Meanwhile, Minsiok moved through the crowd like a shadow, quietly angling small cameras near the edges of the room. Not obvious, not intrusive, just present. He'd learned a long time ago that his family's true face only showed itself when they thought no one important was watching. Tonight, he had a feeling that face was about to show itself completely. The band's music faded. Servers cleared the final course. And then Lady Han rose gracefully from her seat, tapping her glass with a small, elegant sound that silenced the entire room instantly. "It's time," she announced, voice smooth as silk, for the official family portrait. Applause, smiles, guests moving into position. And then Lady Han turned, slowly, deliberately. Her eyes found Odalis across the room, and she pointed directly at her. The ballroom fell into that particular kind of silence that feels louder than screaming. "You're ruining the family photograph," Lady Han said, voice carrying effortlessly across the stunned crowd. "Step out. You don't belong in this family." Every head turned. Every camera hesitated. Somewhere in the back, a glass clinked against a table and no one dared move to pick it up. Odalis felt the weight of hundreds of eyes settle onto her skin like something physical. She thought of her mother's words, "Don't you dare let yourself become one of them." Forgotten, erased, written out of a story simply because someone with power decided she didn't fit the frame. She wouldn't beg, she wouldn't argue, not here. Not in front of people who had already decided the verdict before she said a single word. With as much grace as she could gather, Odalis straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin, and took one quiet step backward, prepared to leave with the only thing no one could take from her, her dignity. But across the room, Juan Rael wasn't watching his mother anymore. He was watching Odalis, watching the exact moment she chose self-respect over pleading for a place she'd already earned 100 times over. And something inside him, something that had been cracking for weeks, finally, completely broke, not into pieces, into clarity. Lady Han raised her chin, already victorious. "Photographer. Continue." Juan Rael didn't answer her. He simply started walking, across the ballroom, past his stunned relatives, past the frozen photographer, past decades of silence that had taught him this exact moment was supposed to be unbearable. It wasn't. It was the easiest thing he'd ever done. He reached Odalis, took her trembling hand in his, and gently, deliberately, led her back into the center of the room, directly beside him, where she belonged. "Anyone," he said, turning to face the room, voice calm but absolute, "who isn't willing to stand beside my future wife is welcome to step out instead." The silence that followed was unbearable. Then, one by one, quietly, almost defiantly, several younger relatives shifted forward, closing ranks around Odalis and Juan Riol instead of retreating. Minseok stepped forward first, then two cousins who'd grown tired of pretending fear was respect, then another and another. Lady Han stood alone at the edge of her own ultimatum, the room rearranging itself right in front of her, without her permission, without her approval, without her control. For the first time in her life, no one followed her lead. The photographer, hands shaking slightly, finally raised the camera. The flash captured all of it. Juan Riol's steady hand around Odalis's, her quiet strength finally being seen instead of tested, and Lady Han standing isolated at the edge of a photograph she no longer controlled. Without a word, Lady Han turned and walked out of the ballroom. Alone. By morning, the photograph had already made its way through both families, not as scandal, the way Lady Han might have once spun it, but as something else entirely. A symbol. Proof that Juan Riol had finally chosen not obedience, not silence, but the truth of who he loved and who he intended to become. Some relatives distanced themselves quietly in the days that followed, uncomfortable with a family suddenly capable of disagreement. But others, more than Juan Riol ever expected, reached out privately. "I've been afraid of her for 15 years. One older cousin admitted quietly. "Thank you for finally showing us it was possible not to be." Lady Han, meanwhile, experienced something entirely foreign to her. Silence. Not the silence she'd cultivated through fear, but the silence of people simply no longer seeking her approval. Invitations that used to require her blessing moved forward without her. Conversations that once orbited her opinions carried on just fine without them. For the first time in her life, she sat alone in her grand penthouse office and felt the true weight of the loneliness she'd built with her own hands. She didn't reach out, not yet. But somewhere behind her composed exterior, something had quietly begun to crack. Meanwhile, Juan Riol found Odalis the morning after the celebration, sitting by the window of her hotel room, sunlight catching the edges of her face. "I owe you more than an apology," he said quietly, sitting across from her. I spent my whole life thinking silence kept people safe, but all it ever did was leave you to fight alone. I'm sorry, not just for what my mother said, for every time I let you carry it by yourself. Odalis studied him for a long moment. Words are easy, Juan Riol, she said softly. I needed to see if you'd ever act like them. I know, he said. So I did. She thought of the ballroom, his hand finding hers without hesitation, his voice steady in a room built entirely on his mother's fear. For the first time, his actions had finally caught up to everything he'd promised. I forgive you, she said quietly. Not because you're perfect, because you finally showed me who you're capable of being. He reached for her hand, and this time she let him hold it. Together, in the quiet that followed, they made a decision that felt less like a plan and more like a promise. Their foundation wouldn't just preserve buildings, it would preserve people the world had forgotten, the same way they'd once been forgotten themselves until someone finally chose to see them. Just as they began sketching the Foundation's first international projects, Odalis's phone buzzed with a message that stopped her breath entirely. Lady Han, asking to meet her, alone. They met in a quiet garden behind the SEO estate, away from cameras, away from staff, away from anyone who might witness whatever this conversation was about to become. Lady Han looked different somehow, smaller, though her posture hadn't changed at all. I owe you an explanation, she said without preamble. Not an apology dressed as one. The truth. Odalis said nothing. She simply waited. I confused two things, Lady Han continued, voice quieter than Odalis had ever heard it. Preserving my family's image, and preserving my family itself. I spent so many years protecting how we appeared to the world. I forgot to protect the people actually living inside it. Odalis studied her carefully. That's honest, she finally said. I'll give you that. I'm not asking you to forget what I did, Lady Han said. I know some wounds don't disappear because someone finally admits causing them. No, Odalis said quietly. They don't. She didn't offer forgiveness in that garden, not yet, but she offered something almost as important. She stayed, she listened, and for the first time, she let Lady Han see her, not as a threat to be managed, but as a person capable of choosing whether or not to let someone back in. Some healing, she was learning, didn't happen all at once. Sometimes it simply began. Months later, the historic Korean American Cultural Center reopened its doors, restored, renewed, and reborn as something entirely new. The Afro-Korean Cultural Preservation Foundation. Gospel choirs filled the same halls where traditional Korean drums had echoed the night before. The smell of soul food mixed unmistakably with the scent of freshly prepared Korean dishes, both spread generously across the same long tables. Lorraine stood beside several SEO relatives who had chosen compassion over hierarchy months earlier, laughing together now like old friends instead of strangers from opposing worlds. A community photographer moved through the crowd, gently asking everyone to gather for a commemorative portrait, but this time, there was no seating chart, no status, no hierarchy dictating who stood where. Children ran between elders, volunteers stood shoulder to shoulder with donors. Both families intermingled naturally, effortlessly, the way people do when nobody's keeping score anymore. Juan Riol reached for Odalis's hand without hesitation, pulling her gently toward the center of the group, and just as the photographer raised the camera, Lady Han quietly stepped aside, not to exclude Odalis this time, to make room for everyone else. The camera captured a family no longer arranged by power, a family united simply by choice. Odalis felt the warmth of the moment settle over her completely. The music, the laughter, the two cultures woven together into something entirely their own. She realized, standing there in the center of a picture she'd once been told she didn't belong in, that she had never actually needed anyone's permission to belong there at all. Juan Riol squeezed her hand gently, and she squeezed back, because love, she now understood, was never about surviving cruelty in silence. It was about the courage to stand beside the people who mattered, publicly, completely, without apology. And together, they had built something far greater than a foundation. They had built a new legacy, one where dignity, compassion, and chosen family became the truest inheritance of all.